Welcome to Professor Burkett's lesson on modifiers, a lesson in punctuating restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers. This lesson in the art of grammar is intimately related to punctuation. Well, let's define some terms. What are restrictive modifiers? Restrictive modifiers are adjectives that limit, restrict, or define the meaning of the noun that they modify. Defining meaning is a matter of logic and of authorial intention. Now here, restrictive equals defining. Restrictive modifiers are not set off by commas because they are necessary to the intended meaning of the sentence. So that's the major principle. An example, the Lamborghini that ran over the fire plug is red and on the sheriff's wanted list. So this is not just any Lamborghini, but the particular Lamborghini that ran over the fire plug. That's the Lamborghini that's on the sheriff's wanted list. Well, what do non-restrictive modifiers not do? Well, non-restrictive modifiers are adjectives in the phrasal or clausal form that do not limit, restrict, or define the noun that they modify. They supply extra but not necessary information about a noun. So non-restrictive here means not defining. Non-restrictive modifiers are set off by commas, or dashes, or parentheses, because they are merely parenthetical. Now it's incorrect to use only one comma. We have to set the parenthetical element off on both sides, or enclose the element in commas, or dashes, or parentheses. An example, oregano, which is also known as majorum or segunda, is a member of the mint family. So the basic sentence is this: oregano is a member of the mint family, but I have inserted a relative clause, which is non-restrictive. It does not define oregano, but it just restates some synonyms for oregano. So that's a good example. Well, what's the form of modifying clauses? Well, there's four kinds of clauses. Do you remember them? Can you name them? Well, there are independent clauses, there are subordinate clauses, there are what clauses, and there are relative clauses, which is the focus of this lesson. In clause form, modifiers begin with relative pronouns, those that are listed in red, or with relative adverbs, those listed in red, for which reason adjective clauses are also called relative clauses. Let's look at two examples. London, which was founded by the Romans, still has its Roman walls in the midst of its contemporary downtown. And so here we have a relative clause that's non-restrictive, and so I set it off by commas. And we know it's a relative clause by the clue here, and the clue is the word which begins the relative clause. Second example, Julius Caesar, who led conquest into England from his London base, returned to Rome claiming Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. A nice triplet parallelism here. So here we have a relative clause that begins with the relative pronoun who, and that sort of interrupts the sentence. And as an interrupter, or non-restrictive clause, I set it off by commas. If I said Julius Caesar returned to Rome claiming Veni Vidi Vici, you would still understand the sentence. Nothing would be lost except for some extra explanatory information. Well, after adjective clauses, let's look at adjective phrases. What's the form of modifying phrases? Well, in three phrasal forms, modifiers begin with participles, appositives, and prepositions, as the respective examples illustrate. First, London, founded by the Romans, still has its Roman walls in the midst of its ultra-modern downtown. And so here we have a past participle, founded, which begins at the modifying phrase here. And it interrupts the sentence, in a sense, because the phrase would make sense if I said London still has its Roman walls. Second, London, a city founded by the Romans, still has its Roman walls. Well, here I have an appositive, that is a phrase that redefines and restates as a synonym the previous noun, which is London. If I took it out, if I took this appositive phrase out of the sentence, it would still make sense. And so it's non-restrictive. Third, London, with its ancient Roman walls still standing, preserves its history in the midst of its modern downtown. And here I have a preposition that starts with, and that starts my prepositional phrase, which interrupts the sentence, and which marks it as a non-restrictive phrase. So if I took out this prepositional non-restrictive phrase, it would still make sense. Well, how do modifiers affect style? Well, first, we should note that style matters. It is usually better styled not to interrupt a clause's subject, verb, object flow with a lengthy modifier. So for the sake of flow and clarity, it is often better to place long modifiers at the front or end of a sentence. So taking a previous example, we might say this sentence is good. Julius Caesar, who led conquests into England from his London base, returned to Rome claiming Veni Vidi Vici. But it would probably be better to move this long adjective relative clause to another place. Okay? And here we're going to move it to the end of the sentence. And that way we keep our subject, verb, object flow together. Julius Caesar returned to Rome claiming Vidi Vidi Vici after leading conquest in England from his London base. Now, it might be better to move the relative adjective clause to the beginning. So, having led conquest into England from his London base, Julius Caesar returned to Rome claiming Vidi Vidi Vici. So the original relative clause is reformed as a past perfect participle phrase, starting with having led. And this revision is best for emphasizing Julius Caesar's famous parallelism, announcing victory. Now, why might this be better than the second example? Well, in the second, the original relative clause is reformed to a participial phrase and is placed at the end, but then the point of the sentence, which is I came, I saw, I conquered, the Veni Vidi Vici, is stuck in the middle of the sentence. And if we want to place it at the end, the place of emphasis, the third example might be the best. Well, in any case, style matters, and we want to avoid interrupting with long phrases or clauses the subject, verb, object flow of a sentence. So what's the central question? For purposes of punctuation, the central question is one of logical definition. Does the modifying clause or phrase define the noun? If yes, the modifier is restrictive and necessary, so no commas are needed. If no, the modifier is non-restrictive and parenthetical, therefore commas are needed. We should set off the clause or phrase with commas on both sides, or use parentheses or dashes to enclose the modifier. What's the major principle? Well, according to Rules for Writers, there's two principles. Use commas to set off non-restrictive elements. Do not use commas to set off restrictive elements. Well, the question for writers is this: is the modifier restrictive or non-restrictive? Well, the rest of this lesson asks you to apply this very question about definition. Are you ready? For here we go. Okay. First, is the following adjective clause restrictive or non-restrictive? He swam for the shore which seemed a mile away. Well, the adjective clause here is non-restrictive, and we should punctuate it with a comma. He swam for shore which seemed a mile away. So the which clause does not define the shore, since only one shore exists. And so it is not necessary to the meaning of the main clause. Therefore, we should set it off with commas. And you might note that when you have which starting a relative clause, it's a clue that it is non-restrictive and is set off with a comma. Is the following adjective clause restrictive or non-restrictive? Public speaking is an activity that most people fear. Well, you're probably right. It is restrictive. The adjective clause is restrictive and does not need commas. So public speaking is an activity that most people fear. Now that clause does define the activity and is necessary to the meaning of the main clause. Therefore, do not set it off with commas. So it's not just any activity that we're talking about, but an activity that most people fear. The following phrase, restrictive or non-restrictive. The squirrel with the bazooka held the cats hostage. Well, the prepositional phrase is restrictive. The squirrel with the bazooka, not just any squirrel, but this one happens to be toting a bazooka with him. So the prepositional phrase defines which squirrel the writer is referring to, the one holding a bazooka. So it is necessary to the meaning of the sentence. Therefore, do not set it off with commas. Well, is the following prepositional phrase restrictive or non-restrictive? The host, with a smile, with a wave of his hand, and with a flamboyant blue vest coat, beckoned us to come in. Well, the adjective phrase, a series of 3 prepositional phrases, is non-restrictive. The host, with a smile, with a wave of his hand, and with a flamboyant blue vest, beckoned us to come in. Now, it's non-restrictive, and therefore I need to set it off with commas. That means I can read the sentence without the long adjective phrase and it still makes sense. The host beckoned us to come in. Well, the prepositional phrases do not define the host, since only one host exists. So the phrases are not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. They are extra. They are parenthetical. Therefore, set off the phrases with commas, dashes, or parentheses. In this case, I think dashes work best to set off the whole series of prepositional phrases. Now a hint is this. Long prepositional phrases are usually set off with commas because they are obtrusively parenthetical. That is, they interrupt the sentence with extra information that are not necessary to defining the grammatical subject. They're not necessary to the sentence itself. Is the following a positive phrase, restrictive or non-restrictive? The Matrix, the Wachowski brothers' first film, made the directors famous. Now let's define what we mean by a positive or something in apposition. That which is in apposition is a phrasal synonym. That is, restating the noun or the noun phrase with a different phrase. So apposition simply means place next to or set next to. And so, for example, the matrix is the noun, the grammatical subject of the sentence, and the appositive phrase is that which restates it in different words, usually as an elaboration to help describe or define it. And so in that sense, we needed to decide whether the appositive phrase is restrictive, that is defining, or non-restrictive, that is parenthetical. Well, the adjective phrase is non-restrictive, which means we set it off with commas. The Matrix, the Wachowski brothers' first film, made the directors famous. The appositive phrase does not define the noun, since it merely redescribes the noun in less specific terms, something as a phrasal synonym. So, the phrase is not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. It is parenthetical. Therefore, we set it off with commas. Now, a hint is this. If the first noun phrase is a proper noun, then the second noun phrase must be less specific. And so, we set it off with commas. Is the following adjective a positive phrase? Is it restrictive or non-restrictive? Do we set it off with commas or not? Well, here the appositive phrase is restrictive. Therefore, we do not set it off with commas. The hit film The Matrix made the Wachowski brothers famous. Now this might be a tricky issue here. So The Matrix is necessary to the meaning of the sentence because the Wachowski brothers wrote and directed more than one film. The appositive phrase defines the sentence's subject. Therefore, do not set it off with commas. Now, a hint on this tricky issue. If the second noun phrase is a proper name, then writers do not set it off with commas because it is more specific. It is necessary to defining the grammatical subject, that is, the subject of the sentence. Okay, is the following adjective phrase restrictive or non-restrictive? Do we set it off with commas or not? Well, similar to the previous example, the adjective appositive phrase here is restrictive, therefore we do not set it off by commas. Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, was considered revolutionary. Well, the title of the opera, The Marriage of Figaro, and we know it's a title of a major work because it is italicized. So the Marriage of Figaro is necessary to the meaning of the sentence because Mozart wrote more than one opera. The appositive phrase defines the sentence's subject. That is, it's much more specific. Mozart's opera, well, which? The Marriage of Figaro. Therefore, we do not set off this appositive phrase with commas. Well, the following adjective participial phrase, is it restrictive or non-restrictive? Do we set it off with commas or not? Well, here, the adjective participial phrase is non-restrictive, and therefore we set it off with commas. Okay, let's read it together. The shift from modernism to postmodernism, beginning in the late 20th century, centers on new understandings of language, culture, and interpretation. Well, the longish participial phrase does not define the cultural shift, but is merely extra information or parenthetical. Therefore, we should set it off with commas. Whether it occurs in the middle of the sentence, as it does here as an interrupter, or whether we shift it to the left towards the beginning of the sentence, or whether we shift it to the right at the end of the sentence. For instance, if I read, beginning in the late 20th century, the shift from modernism to postmodernism centers on new understandings, and so forth, I would still need to set off the participial phrase because it is non-restrictive. Is the short adjective participial phrase restrictive or non-restrictive? Well, this short adjective participial phrase is restrictive, therefore we do not use commas. The postmodern shift regarding language and culture has occurred in the last 30 or 40 years. So the participial phrase helps define what shift we're talking about. The participial phrase does define the sentence's subject and is necessary to the meaning of the sentence. Therefore, writers do not set it off with commas. Well, let's review the principles, focusing on 4 diagnostic questions. First, or principle 1, watch for definition. In question form, you might ask this: does the modifier define its noun, thus making it necessary to the meaning of the noun? For instance, the squirrel with the bazooka, not just any rodent. Okay, if so, it's restrictive and no commas are necessary. Diagnostic question 2, starting with the principle. Watch for the relative pronouns that and which. Is the modifier introduced by the word that? If so, it is restrictive. No comma necessary before the relative pronoun that. Is the modifier introduced by the word which? If so, it is probably restrictive or non-restrictive. Set it off with commas. However, which can act as a synonym for that. And so just because you see which doesn't mean you use a comma all the time. Many writers use which in a restrictive sense, but usually we use it in a non-restrictive sense. Diagnostic question 3, starting with the principle. Check to see if you can safely delete the relative pronoun. Can you delete the relative pronoun without causing ambiguity or confusion? For instance, public speaking is an activity that most people fear. or public speaking is an activity most people fear? If so, the clause is restrictive. No commas necessary if you can delete the relative pronoun. Diagnostic question 4, the principle. Check noun phrases in apposition. Isn't a positive word or phrase more specific than its preceding noun? For instance, Fred's wife, Wilma, vacuums with an elephant. If so, it is restrictive. No commas are necessary. Now here, Fred's wife is another way of stating Wilma, and Wilma is another way of stating Fred's wife. And so these are actually in apposition, and that's what we mean here. Now, if the second word or phrase is more specific, okay, and that's what we're talking about here, if it's more specific, then it is restrictive. Let's apply diagnostic question 4 with a different but common situation. The principle, again, is to check the noun phrases in apposition. When a proper name precedes a title, the title is always non-restrictive. It's set off by commas. Example, Bruce Ashford, provost of Southeastern, and his wife have a new baby. Or conversely, when the title precedes the name, the more specific name is always a restrictive phrase. Okay, so when a title precedes somebody's name, we don't use commas. For instance, Provost Bruce Ashford is a new dad. Let's apply our principles and take a short quiz. Which is correct? People who smell bad should take a shower, or people who smell bad should take a shower? Now you might be thinking, well, it relies upon the context, and that's true. Since restrictive and non-restrictive is a matter of definition and of authorial intention, then we have to know the context to really answer the question. But we're just going to try to choose the standard or the normal meaning of each sentence. Okay, so here we have a who clause that modifies people. And do we think it's restrictive or non-restrictive? Now, restrictive implies a smaller group of people, and non-restrictive suggests a larger group of people. So here I think we need to interpret this as a smaller group of people. That is, people who actually smell bad should take a shower. So I would think number 1 would be correct. That was a long explanation just for an answer, but sometimes it takes that, and that's why it's a tricky issue. How about this one? Which is correct? The 2 drivers involved in the accident who have been convicted of drunk driving should lose their licenses, or the 2 drivers involved in the accident who have been convicted of drunk driving should lose their licenses. Well, here I think number 1 is correct again. And since it's a non-restrictive element, okay, it suggests a larger group. That is, the 2 drivers involved in the accident who have also been convicted of drunk driving previously should lose their licenses. Which is correct? The weird animal in the grass loves to scare people, or the weird animal in the grass loves to scare people? Well, here I think the restrictive prepositional phrase implies a smaller or more specific group here, or individual. The weird animal in the grass loves to scare people. That is number 1. The second implies that there might be a number of weird animals, and that's outside of the frame of our picture here. Well, which is correct? Belinda, who rarely shaves, still seems to attract the guys. Or Belinda, who rarely shaves, still seems to attract the guys. Well, here I think number 1. That is, Belinda, who also happens to shave rarely, seems to attract the guys. So number 1 is the correct answer again. Well, which is correct? McDonald's, the fattiest restaurant on the planet, has contributed to our population being obese. Or McDonald's, the fattiest restaurant on the planet, has contributed to our population being obese. Well, here the positive phrase that is lengthy and that redefines McDonald's in phrasal form needs to be set off by commas. And so our correct answer is number 1 again. Finally, our last quiz question. And let's read these two. The bus drivers rejecting the management offer remained on strike. Number 2, the bus drivers rejecting the management offer remained on strike. Well, here it is clear that yes, the commas do change the meaning. So for instance, sentence number 1, which is non-restrictive, means a larger group. That is all the bus drivers. All the bus drivers who also rejected the management offer remained on strike. Well, number 2, that is the restrictive prepositional phrase without the commas, refers to a smaller group. The bus drivers rejecting the management offer, that is, only those bus drivers who rejected the management offer remained on strike. So which is correct? Well, it depends on the situation. Either one could be correct depending on the context and the writer's intent for writing the sentence. What did the writer have in mind? So in any case, the commas change the meaning of the sentence. At the end of this lesson, you might reflect on how much discernment you have applied in distinguishing between restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers. And we will probably agree with philosopher John Stuart Mill, who writes, "The structure of every sentence is a lesson in logic." Well, it's a lesson in logic because we need to discern whether a modifier is definitional or merely descriptive. That's the question, and that's what we will apply in class. I look forward to seeing you soon.